Every spring, millions of Christians gather to celebrate the most important event in their faith. They sing about the empty tomb, they preach about the resurrection, and they call the day Easter. Because it is the climax of the Christian calendar, you might assume the word itself is written all over the New Testament. You might expect to find it in the Gospels, right next to the story of the stone rolling away. You might expect the Apostle Paul to use it in his letters when he explains the victory of Christ over death. But you will not find it there. In fact, in almost every modern Bible translation, the word Easter does not appear a single time. That sounds impossible. It is not. The highest holiday in the Christian world is attached to a word that the biblical authors never actually wrote. But if you step back and look at the history of the English Bible, there is one famous exception. There is one single, highly debated moment where the word Easter suddenly appears on the printed page. To find it, you have to read the King James Version of the Bible, and you have to turn to the book of Acts, chapter 12. The chapter opens with a crisis. King Herod is moving violently against the early church. He has just executed James, the brother of John. Seeing that this pleases his political audience, he proceeds to arrest the Apostle Peter. The text tells us that Herod throws Peter into prison, heavily guarded by 4 squads of soldiers. And then, in verse 4, the King James translators tell us Herod's timeline. He intends to keep Peter locked up, planning to bring him out to the people after Easter. For over 400 years, English speakers read this verse and built an assumption. They assumed that Luke, the author of Acts, was talking about a recognized Christian holiday. They assumed Herod was waiting for the early believers to finish their spring resurrection festival before he executed their leader. It paints a picture of an early church already celebrating the holiday we know today. But there is a historical problem with that image. The events of Acts chapter 12 happened in the very early days of the Christian movement. At this point, the believers in Jerusalem were not celebrating a separate, formalized, Western spring holiday. The early church in Jerusalem was made up of Jewish believers. They were still deeply connected to the biblical calendar given in the Old Testament. They were still worshiping in the rhythm of their ancestors. Herod was not waiting for a Christian holiday to end. He was waiting for something much older. If you look at the original Greek language sitting underneath that single verse in the book of Acts, you do not find a new Christian festival. You do not find a disconnected spring celebration. You find an ancient Jewish one. And that raises a massive question. If the original word was not Easter, why did the most famous English translation in history choose to put it there? To answer that, we have to look closely at the word Luke actually wrote in the original manuscript. We have to look at the word sitting beneath the English ink. The word Luke wrote in the 1st century was not a new Christian invention. It was not a word associated with spring, or sunrise services, or the changing of the seasons. The Greek word Luke wrote is Pascha. Now, we have to pause here. Because if you look up Pascha in an ancient Greek dictionary, you will find something fascinating. It is not actually a Greek word by origin. It is a transliteration. It is a word brought over from another language entirely. When the Jewish people spoke Hebrew, the word was Pesach. When they spoke Aramaic, which was the common spoken language of Jesus and his disciples, the word was Pascha. And when the writers of the New Testament sat down to write their accounts in Greek, they did not invent a new Greek term. They simply borrowed the Aramaic word and spelled it out using Greek letters. It means Passover, not a new church holiday, not a replacement festival, the ancient, historical Jewish feast of Passover. Let that sink in. When the author of Acts wrote chapter 12, he was not describing a Christian community that had abandoned its roots to start a new religious calendar. He was describing a community that still marked time by the story of the Exodus. We know this is true because Luke gives us the exact context just one sentence earlier. In Acts chapter 12, verse 3, Luke tells us precisely when Peter was arrested. He writes that it happened during the festival of unleavened bread. Any reader in the ancient world knew exactly what that meant. The festival of unleavened bread was the strict, 7-day biblical feast that began on the evening of the Passover. Luke was not talking about a springtime Christian celebration. He was giving his readers a historical timestamp. Herod was arresting Peter during the highest, holiest week of the Jewish year. He was holding Peter in a heavily guarded prison because he did not want to cause a political riot during the crowded festival. Herod was simply waiting for Pascha to end. In the original Greek text of the New Testament, The word Pascha appears 29 times, and in 28 of those instances, even the King James Version translates it correctly. It is the word used when Jesus travels to Jerusalem as a 12-year-old boy. It is the word used when he gathers his disciples in the upper room to break bread. It is the word used when the crowds shout to Pilate, asking him to release a prisoner according to the custom of the festival. 28 times, the English translators looked at the manuscript, saw the word Pascha, and wrote the word Passover. But in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, they made a very strange choice. They looked at the exact same Greek word, in the exact same historical context, and they wrote Easter. That detail is not random. It is not just a harmless variation in spelling. It is a doorway into a massive collision between ancient biblical theology and European history. So if the original word was always Passover, why did one of the most famous English translations in history choose to write the word Easter? And where did that word even come from? The story of how the word Easter ended up in the English Bible begins long before the King James Version was printed. It starts in the early 1500s, with the very first attempts to translate the scriptures into the language of everyday people. At that time, the Bible was locked in Latin. Ordinary men and women could not read it. When early translators decided to bring the text into English, they ran into a massive linguistic wall. English did not have a word for the Hebrew concept of the Passover. To understand why, you have to look at the history of the English language itself. Long before the British Isles were fully Christianized, the Anglo-Saxons had a local word for the spring season. The month of April was known as Eosterminath. Some historians believe it was named after a local goddess of the dawn. Others argue it simply referred to the season of the rising sun and the waking earth. Over time, as Christianity spread through the region, the local believers did not invent a completely new vocabulary for the spring resurrection festival. They just repurposed the old word. The ancient word Eostre slowly became Easter. By the Middle Ages, if you said the word Easter in England, you were not talking about pagan mythology. You were simply talking about the time of year when the church celebrated the empty tomb. It was the common, everyday word for the resurrection season. Then came William Tyndale. Tyndale was a brilliant 16th century linguist who set out to translate the Old Testament directly from Hebrew into English for the very first time. When he reached the story of the Exodus, he faced a problem. He had to translate the Hebrew word Pesach. The original word carried the idea of skipping, hovering over, or passing by. Tyndale looked at the English language and realized there was no equivalent word. So he did something incredibly bold. He invented one. He took the English word pass, and he combined it with the word over. William Tyndale literally created the word Passover so that English readers could understand what God did in Egypt. It was a masterpiece of translation. But when Tyndale moved on to translate the New Testament, he lived in a cultural world where the English church already called the spring season Easter. So in a few places in his translation, including Acts chapter 12, Tyndale used the familiar cultural word. Nearly a century later, when the King James translators sat down to create their defining version of the Bible in 1611, they relied heavily on Tyndale's earlier work. By this point in history, scholars recognized that Passover was the much better, more accurate translation for the Greek word Pascha. So, the translation committee went through the New Testament and corrected the text. Almost every single time the word appeared, they changed it to Passover, except for one. In Acts chapter 12, verse 4, for reasons that historians and linguists still debate today, they left the older cultural word in place. They wrote Easter. At first glance, that looks like a harmless translation quirk. It looks like a linguistic accident left behind by a team of overworked 17th century scholars. It is not. The King James translators were simply using the common vocabulary of their day, but in doing so, they accidentally severed a deep theological cord. They took a Jewish festival and disguised it as a European holiday, and in the process, they covered up a connection that the earliest Christians fought hard to keep intact. To see why that matters, we have to leave the printing presses of 16th century England. We have to go back to the ancient world and look at how the first believers actually remembered the story. If you traveled back to the 2nd or 3rd century and asked a Christian how they celebrated Easter, they would not know what you were talking about. They did not have a holiday named after a spring season. They did not have a festival completely disconnected from the Hebrew scriptures. What they had was Pascha. And to understand how they celebrated it, you have to forget everything you know about modern spring holidays. In the early church, the annual celebration of the resurrection was not a sunny Sunday morning service that stood entirely on its own. It was a long, intense, and deeply rooted vigil. History tells us that early Christians would gather on the night before Resurrection Sunday. They would stay awake through the darkness. They would fast. And as they waited for the dawn, they did not just read the stories of the empty tomb. They read the book of Exodus. They opened the text and read the ancient story of the Jewish people trapped in Egypt. They read about a brutal empire. They read about a captive people. And they read about the night God commanded every family to take an unblemished lamb, sacrifice it, and paint its blood on the wooden doorposts of their homes. They read the ancient promise that when the judgment of God moved through the empire of Egypt, it would pass over any house covered by the blood. For the early Christians, reading this story was not just a history lesson. It was not a nostalgic look back at a Jewish tradition they had left behind. It was the exact lens through which they understood the resurrection. As the sun began to rise on Sunday morning, the early church would break their fast. They would celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, but they celebrated it knowing precisely what the empty tomb meant. It meant the final exodus had happened. They understood that humanity was trapped under a pharaoh much worse than the king of Egypt. We were trapped under the empire of sin and the finality of death. We needed a rescue we could not achieve ourselves. So when the early Christians celebrated Pascha, they were saying something radical. They were saying that Jesus was the true lamb. They were saying the cross was the true wooden doorpost. They were saying that because of his blood, the ultimate judgment of death had passed over us. The old Passover was about escaping slavery in a physical nation. The new Pascha was about escaping the slavery of death itself. The early church fought to keep this memory alive. In fact, for the first few centuries, there were massive debates among church leaders about exactly which day on the calendar to celebrate the resurrection. But the debate was never about whether to call it Easter. The debate was about how closely they should tie their celebration to the exact mathematical date of the Jewish Passover. They were terrified of losing the connection. They knew that if you separate the resurrection from the Exodus, you lose the vocabulary of the gospel. You flatten the story. You turn the deepest rescue mission in history into a generic celebration of springtime renewal. The early believers refused to do that. They held tightly to the word Pascha because it anchored their faith in the long, unfolding story of God's covenant. But this deep connection was not just a theological idea invented by the early church. They did not just look back at the Exodus and try to forcefully attach it to Jesus to make his story sound more epic. This connection was not a later church tradition. It was deliberately designed by Jesus himself, built right into the exact timing of his death. Jesus did not die during the Passover by accident. He was not caught off guard by a sudden political uprising. He was not a victim of terrible timing. The events of Holy Week were not a tragedy that just happened to interrupt a Jewish festival. They were the fulfillment of it. If you look closely at the final days of his life, you begin to see that Jesus was deliberately organizing his steps around the ancient calendar of the Exodus. In the book of Exodus, chapter 12, God gave the Israelites highly specific instructions for the first Passover. They were told to select a lamb. It had to be unblemished. It had to be brought into the household on the 10th day of the month. And then, it had to be kept and examined until the 14th day. Now, look at the timeline of the Gospels. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey right as the crowds are gathering for the festival. He enters the city precisely when the families of Israel are selecting their lambs. And for the next several days, what happens? He is publicly examined. He is tested by the Pharisees. He is questioned by the Sadducees. He is interrogated by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. And at the end of all the questioning, Pilate stands before the crowd and declares that he finds no fault in him. That is not just a legal detail. The gospel writers are showing us that the true lamb was being examined, and he was found to be entirely without blemish. But the pattern does not stop there. In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, we are given a detail about the crucifixion that is very easy to read past. John tells us that the Roman soldiers came to break the legs of the men on the crosses to speed up their deaths. But when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead, so they did not break his legs. To a modern reader, that sounds like a minor historical note. But to a first-century Jewish reader, it was an earthquake. Because centuries earlier, God had given a strict command about the Passover lamb. In the book of Exodus, the instruction was clear: do not break any of its bones. John was not just giving his readers a medical update. He was giving them a theological revelation. He was telling them that the ancient shadow had finally met its substance. The original Passover in Egypt was never meant to be the end of the story. It was the quiet architecture of redemption. The blood painted on the wooden doorposts in the ancient world was preparing the human imagination for the blood that would be poured out on the wood of the Roman cross. The first rescue delivered a nation from a political empire. The final rescue delivered humanity from the empire of sin and death. When you see this pattern, you realize why the early church fought so hard to keep the word Pascha. They were not looking for a new holiday to celebrate the coming of spring. They were standing in awe of a God who had kept a promise he made to Moses. The writers of the New Testament knew this pattern well. They understood exactly what had happened on that Friday in Jerusalem. And in one of his letters, the Apostle Paul makes this connection so explicitly that it changes how we must read the entire resurrection story. The Apostle Paul understood this pattern better than almost anyone in the ancient world. Before his conversion, Paul was a Pharisee. He was a strict scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures. He knew the Exodus story inside and out. He had celebrated the Passover every year of his life. He knew exactly what the unblemished lamb meant, what the bitter herbs meant, and what the blood on the doorpost signified. When Paul looked back at the cross, he did not see a random Roman political execution. He saw an altar. We see this most clearly in a letter he wrote to the early church in the city of Corinth. It is found in 1 Corinthians, chapter 5. Paul is writing to a mixed community of Jewish and Gentile believers. He is trying to explain how they should live, how they should deal with sin, and how they should understand what Jesus actually accomplished. To make his point, Paul reaches directly for the language of the Exodus. He tells the church to get rid of the old yeast, referring to the ancient practice of clearing all yeast out of the house before the festival of unleavened bread. And then, in verse 7, Paul makes a definitive statement. He writes, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." If you look at the original Greek manuscript of that verse, Paul does not use a long, complicated theological phrase. He uses one single word. He uses the word Pascha. He literally writes, "For our Pascha has been sacrificed, even Christ." Notice what Paul is doing here. He is using the exact same Greek word that Luke used in Acts chapter 12. He is using the exact same word that the King James translators turned into Easter. But Paul is not talking about a spring holiday. He is not talking about a season of the year. He is giving Jesus a title. Paul is looking directly at the cross and calling Jesus our Passover. This is not a loose metaphor. It is not just a piece of poetic imagery. Paul is making a massive theological claim. He is saying that everything the ancient Israelites experienced in Egypt was pointing directly to this one moment in history. The empire, the slavery, the rescue, the unblemished lamb, the blood on the wood. It was all a shadow, waiting for the true Pascha to arrive. To separate the resurrection from the Passover is to lose the very vocabulary the apostles used to explain the cross. If you take the Exodus out of the story, Paul's letter stops making full sense. If you replace the Jewish Pascha with a completely disconnected spring festival, you flatten out the deepest theology of the New Testament. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of translation details. We started with what looked like a confusing English choice in the book of Acts. Then we looked at the original Greek word underneath the ink. Then we saw how the early church fought to keep the memory of the Exodus alive. And now, the same truth is becoming impossible to ignore in the letters of Paul. The word was not just a timestamp. It was the theological center of how the early church understood the mission of Jesus. But this raises a deeper problem. If the New Testament writers tied the death and resurrection of Jesus so tightly to the Pascha, what happens to modern believers when they sever that connection entirely? What is the actual theological cost of forgetting the Exodus when we look at the empty tomb? When we look at the empty tomb without looking at the Exodus, we accidentally change the story. Today, most Christians view the resurrection as a standalone miracle. We treat it like an isolated event where Jesus simply proved his power by defeating death. And it is true that Jesus defeated death. But if that is the only way we tell the story, we are missing the foundation. God did not just drop the resurrection out of nowhere. He did not suddenly decide to perform a spectacular miracle in the first century without any preparation. He spent hundreds of years building a vocabulary so that when the final rescue happened, his people would know exactly what they were looking at. He started with a promise to Abraham. He moved to the rescue of Moses. He built the tabernacle. He established the priesthood. He commanded the festivals. For centuries, the people of Israel lived inside this rhythm. Every year, they sacrificed a lamb. Every year, they remembered the blood on the doorposts. Every year, they remembered that God had rescued them from slavery. When modern readers separate the resurrection from the Passover, when we stop using the word Pascha and replace it with a cultural spring holiday, we risk telling people that the Old Testament does not matter anymore. We risk making it sound like God tried one plan with Israel, watched it fail, threw it away, and started a new, completely disconnected religion called Christianity. But that is not what the biblical authors believed. The old system was not bad. It was incomplete. It was not a mistake. It was a shadow. The physical rescue from Egypt was entirely real, but it was not final. It was pointing toward a deeper rescue that would cover the entire world. The blood of the first lamb was necessary, but it was temporary. It was preparing the human imagination for a lamb whose sacrifice would never need to be repeated. Jesus does not erase the ancient pattern. He fulfills it. When Jesus walked out of the tomb on Sunday morning, he was not stepping away from the Hebrew scriptures. He was bringing the entire covenant story of Israel to its breathtaking, earth-shattering climax. If we lose the memory of the Passover, we flatten the Bible. We turn it into two disconnected books. We turn Jesus into a powerful but isolated miracle worker, instead of the faithful king who kept the ancient promises of God. But when we put the two halves back together, everything changes. When we finally see the resurrection through the lens of the Passover, the empty tomb carries a much heavier weight. It is no longer just a generic story about life after death. It is the story of the great Exodus. It is the moment God reached into the ultimate Egypt, the dark empire of the grave, and pulled humanity out alive. And once you see the resurrection this way, you realize the pattern does not end in the first century. The vocabulary of the Passover does not just explain the past. It prepares us for the very end of the Bible. The story has one final destination, and the ancient memory is waiting for us there too. The pattern we have been tracing does not end with the Apostle Paul. It does not stop in the first century. It reaches all the way to the very last pages of the Bible. In the book of Revelation, chapter 5, the Apostle John is given a breathtaking vision of the heavenly throne room. He is looking for someone worthy to open the scroll of human history. He is told to look for a conquering king. He is told to look for the Lion of the tribe of Judah. But when John actually turns to look, the image shifts completely. He does not see a lion. He writes that he saw a lamb, standing as though it had been slain. Even in the throne room of heaven, at the absolute climax of the cosmos, Jesus is still bearing the marks of the Exodus. He is the eternal Pascha. When the angels and the elders fall down to worship him, they do not sing about a springtime renewal. They sing about a rescue. They sing that by his blood, he has ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and nation. It is the ultimate Exodus song. And this brings us back to the question we started with in the book of Acts. Is it historically or theologically wrong to use the English word Easter today? Does that single, highly debated translation choice in the King James Version mean modern believers are celebrating something disconnected from the Bible? The safest reading of history says no. Languages change, and words evolve over time. The European word Easter lost its ancient cultural baggage centuries ago. For millions of believers today, it is simply the familiar vocabulary used to announce that the grave is empty. The debate over the English word is ultimately a secondary issue. But what is not secondary is the memory that the word might accidentally obscure. What matters is that we do not let a European cultural word erase a deep, foundational biblical theology. The early Christians fought to protect the word Pascha because they knew they were not abandoning the story of Israel. They knew they were stepping into its grand finale. When the early church gathered in the dark before dawn, they were not just waiting for the physical sun to rise. They were waiting to celebrate the ultimate Passover. If we only talk about springtime and sunrise and rolling stones, we are telling a true story, but we are telling a flat one. We have to remember the slavery. We have to remember the heavy, dark empire of death. We have to remember the blood painted on the wooden doorposts. Because when we do, the resurrection stops being just an isolated display of power. it becomes the exact rescue mission God promised. It is the moment the true, unblemished Lamb took the judgment of the world upon himself, so that the final plague of death would pass over us forever. If this journey through the text has helped you see the resurrection with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next deep dive into Scripture. We started in the book of Acts with what looked like a strange English choice, but sitting just beneath the ink was a much older, much heavier truth. The word was never just a translation debate. It was the bridge between the shadow of Egypt and the dawn of the new creation.